Every summer, for the past few years, a group of friends and I have traveled from our homes in Liverpool in the UK to Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland. Dumfries in Galloway is home to the largest continuous forest in the whole United Kingdom, Galloway Forest Park. It's about as wild as it gets for the UK, with some parts of the woods being so dense and overgrown that it's clear nobody has stepped foot in them for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Our yearly visits brought us peace, clarity, and a respect for nature. But last year's trip ended in one of the most horrifying and distressing incidents of my entire life. One that completely changed the way I see the world and the way I consider the human mind. Year in, year out, we'd take an overnight coach up across the border, then hike out to a place called Loch Aber. The loch is a private fishing lake, supposedly reserved for members of a local fishing club who ensure that the waters are chock full of fish for them to catch, which makes it oh so easy for us to pull a quick in-and-out raid to catch enough of a small fish for our dinner. I'm serious. 45 minutes and we're golden, and take it from any fisherman. That is lightning speed for a half-decent catch. But last year, we decided we were tired of the same old digs and set our gazes further afield. A map told us that there was a similarly deep loch about 30 miles east known as Loch D. We figured it would be a perfect fishing spot, and we were right. Sure, it wasn't a quick fire as the private members' lake, but it came with considerably less guilt. Everything was perfect. That was until the second night, when in the middle of a campfire drinking session, one of my buddies jumped out of his seat and recoiled from the fire. "Who is that?" he asked, sort of calmly at first, nothing more than cautious confusion. "Who's who?" Someone replies lazily. "Someone moving through the trees back there." He was pointing into the trees directly behind my back. I actually gave a hoot of sarcastic laughter at first, thinking he was just trying to scare us. But the moment it became obvious that he was not messing around, a jolt of fear went through me, and I too leapt out of my seat, spun around, and shined my torch into the darkness. You could feel the tension among us rising as we desperately looked around for who might be talking about. Torch beams darted across the trees, inspecting every trunk or thicket of bushes, but there was nothing. No sign of the person my friend had seen. "Hello?" someone called out, immediately shushed by the rest of us. No one wanted to give away our position, but at the same time, we needed to know if there was anybody out there watching us. But again, nothing. Just silence. "I think you've had a bit too much to drink, mate," I remember saying to the guy who supposedly seen a figure walking through the trees. "I'm fine. I've barely touched the bells I brought. I swear to God, I just saw somebody just then." "Like who?" somebody asked. "Man? Woman? Young? Old? What?" I don't know," he replied shakily. "But they were big. Really big. Only big thing around here is your bloody imagination. Now go and get your head down. It's been a long day." And it had, thanks to the overnight coach. Nobody really sleeps on the journey up to Scotland. I mean, they close their eyes, put some chill music through their earphones, but they never really sleep. So everyone ends up being pretty wrecked by the end of the first night. The next morning, we felt even worse. The first night after such a long journey is usually one where we sleep like the dead, but not that night. None of us could quite relax, not with the possibility of having somebody stalking us in the backs of our minds. Thank God we were planning on to fish that day, as we really were not in the mood for anything else, given how bloody exhausted we were. After breakfast, we marched down to the loch with our fishing gear. It's a gorgeous area, a crisp blue lake ringed by hills. It's not unusual to get some really nice sunny days up in Scotland too, especially during the summer. But that day, the sky was this horrible grimy gray, like the sun had barely risen at all. I was tired, half soaked from the drizzle, barely even excited to be fishing for my dinner. I actually hoped for something exciting to happen, and for my sins, my wish came true. "Look," one of us had shouted. "Over there, other side of the lock. Can you see that thing?" It was the same lad that seen somebody or something walking through the trees. Where? We were terrified. One sighting could have been his eyes playing tricks on him. Another couldn't possibly be a mistake. "There," he said, pointing. "Just on the other side. It came out of the trees for a moment, then disappeared again. Please tell me you saw that." "Mate, just calm down. It's probably just..." "I know what I saw, and we need to get out of these bloody woods right now," he said, grabbing up his fishing gear in panic. I remember him rushing off back to camp, one of the lads following him, still trying to calm him down. But it was impossible. He was manic, scared half to death by whatever had briefly emerged from the woods on the other side of the lock. I asked the other boys if they'd seen anything. Each shook their head. None had any idea what they were talking about, but that didn't mean they were just freaked out over his outburst. We were supposed to stay for 7 full nights, but that second one was our last. We'd managed to talk to the lad who was panicking down, convince him to stay a few more nights at the very least. We'd come all this way, and I wasn't about to let one of us just leave because they'd had a wee scare or something. But it didn't end there either. In the middle of the night, the lad that had been seeing something burst out of his tent, waking each of us up before asking, "Can you hear that?" There was silence. Dead silence. I mean, I strained my ears trying to hear what had shook him so bad. But I heard nothing. Just the rustling of a few sleeping bags as confused blokes sat up awake. He was scratching his own ears, gritting his teeth, rocking back and forth in the dirt as the sounds seemed to completely overwhelm him. That's the exact moment I realized. I think the same moment everyone else picked up on it too. That there was no noise. There was no monster. It was all in his head. He was experiencing a psychotic break, and it was all in his head. My grandmother told me recently about things that she's seen and experienced when she was in her youth. My grandmother is part Sioux, Apache, Navajo, Ute, and another tribe that I can't remember. She's moved around a lot as a kid because her father couldn't hold down a steady job, and her mother and her father, well, that's another story. They would get evicted and forced to move place to place. Her father was able to hold on to a decent job for about 6 years before getting into a terrible car accident that nearly cost him his life and his ability to move. Shortly after, he would pass away. For those 6 years, they lived just outside the Tonto National Forest in Arizona. My grandmother always described to me how beautiful her backyard was. It stretched out for miles and miles, and even had a small creek running along the backside, with multiple bridges and cross points that led to old deserted logging roads and game trails. She also spoke of that when the property was first being constructed years and years back, they had built a small community cemetery on the back side of that same land. A small cemetery for that area that probably held around 50 to 70 grave sites. Years down the road, as they expanded the area and industrialized more and more, they actually dug and moved all the graves that were in that cemetery and transported them to a new gravesite. I'm not sure what the point of it was and at what point they discovered, but she spoke about them finding during this time that there was a larger area further back that was used as a native burial ground. It had been largely grown over and lost to man, as it was described to me through years and years of abandonment. I was told this was a burial site that dated hundreds and hundreds of years back, far before the property of her family's was ever set. When she was a little girl, her father never allowed her to play back there on that side of the land because of the energy he would describe to her was bad. She could get taken, hurt, or even worse. There were times as she got older, she would wait for her father to either leave or get preoccupied with something. She would sneak back to that area of the land when she could, and would always regret it. She went back there a small handful of times without getting caught. She described it to me as very dark. You just got this feeling you weren't alone and surrounded by hostility. It was very uncomfortable to be walking around in. You always felt like you were being watched, like a visitor in a home that you were unwelcome in. That will always stick with me when she told me about that. When she had gotten far enough back, she discovered what she explains as large mounds of dirt and rock. These are very large mounds, and they looked well constructed. The first time she saw them, they were further back in the thickness of the woods, but still visible from the burial ground area. That's when she thought the idea of coming back in the early morning with a flashlight while her dad was asleep was a good idea, and explore a little more thoroughly and get a much closer look at those mounds. Even though it was very creepy being back there, it was an immense thrill, a total adrenaline rush. My grandmother has always been that kind of lady anyway, so when she told me about all this, I guess I shouldn't be too shocked. This is the same kind of lady that goes skydiving, bungee jumping, rock climbing, you name it. She's always been crazy like that, and being the free spirit that she is, this story that she told me isn't the first or probably last time she'll experience things beyond our plane of existence. That and her native roots and cultural roots. Her father was half Navajo and half Ute, and at the time worked alongside a few others at this ranch, not far away from where they lived at the time. He was a great dad, she would tell me, but was overly protective of her, even when it came to the spirits and what my wild grandmother would tamper with in her teenage years, like witchcraft, etc. But I'll save that for later in this story. Sorry to veer off so much. Anyway, so she waited a few days until where she could sneak out at night and have a flashlight handy and ready for an early morning adventure. She went to bed like normal that night, pretending to be asleep, only to wait till the moon was directly overhead in the sky before she made her descent out of her window. There was cloud coverage, but the moon still had plenty of time to shine through, sometimes casting its own shadows. It was mostly cloud coverage that made for the journey into the pitch black complete. Anything she could do to defy her father and push forward in the face of adventure. This was around mid to late July. The night was still warm from the hot day, and everything was lush and thick. It made things even darker. She recalled the walk to just get to the area of land that was uncomfortable. She began getting hives on her skin at points, and feeling this burning sensation on her arms and legs, like someone was touching her with a hot poker. She talked a lot about how the walk to the burial ground area was even more unnerving. The darkness felt thick at night. It felt like it was alive and surrounding her. There was a strong sense of bad feelings and energy all around. Even more, now that she was enshrouded by the darkness of night. As crazy as my grandmother is, she continued to push on, despite her whole body telling her to get out of there. That's right about when she had her first sighting of this creature. She makes it to the back burial area and goes further this time into the area, out towards the burial mounds. This is when she was talking to me, how it became hard to physically go back there. It was like this unforeseen force trying to hold her back so she couldn't go further, but she did. Once into the small burial site, she said her flashlight's light reached less and less further. The darkness physically became thicker, which is something she had never experienced before, but would later encounter in different scenarios. Again, we'll talk about that later. Here is where things go haywire. Upon reaching the burial mounds, she noticed there were 3 of them, spaced no more than a few hundred feet away from each other, with small overgrown paths made to each one. These mounds were large, far larger than her. On the back side of the first one, she noticed a large hole that dropped down into the ground on the back of this mound. It was like a hole that then dropped down into the earth. Think like a small outcropping, and then a hole that leads down on the back side of this first mound. With her flashlight, She couldn't see where it led to. She just knew it was down into the earth. Every fiber in her being was screaming to get out of there. She knew she was being watched, that this place was full of bad spirits and energy, but she didn't care. If she could just check out the mounds, she would have been satisfied. Just as she was able to walk to the second mound, she began hearing light footsteps from all around her, approaching her. She shined her light rapidly, but never saw anything, calling out and asking who was there. Of course, no response. Right at that moment is when something very large came out of the hole behind her from the back of the mound. She shined her light, and to her horror, what she describes as this large, reptile humanoid creature steps out. Eyes like a cat, sharp and piercing, and a face so hideous and fierce, she froze up. Before I go on, this is the point that I began asking her all sorts of questions of what this thing looked like, because even I was apprehensive to believe her in the moment. I know my grandmother is crazy, but I know she is not a liar, and the genuine fear she expressed to me when describing this creature she saw is a little disturbing, to say the least. It had larger scales, a very snake, serpent-like face, with sharp, jagged teeth protruding from the top and bottom. The teeth were long and pointed. Its arms were long, extending further than its waist, and had hard, exaggerated hands. It had hard, defined, rippling muscles underneath its thick scales, and stood much taller than her. She knew down in her being, in her very inner core, that she was going to die, or be taken by this thing, down into that hole that it crawled out of. This being that she understood was pure evil, and had dark energy radiating off of it. So much so that she told me she felt this creature coming before it stepped out of the hole behind her, along with the approaching footsteps around her. That's when this being spoke to her. She talked about never experiencing telepathy before in her life, and didn't know that could exist until this very moment. Whatever kind of being this was, speaking telepathically to her, that this being lured her in, and now was going to kill her. It began to approach her, and that's when she described to me, like a large hand that was holding her tightly, let go. Her body bolted, and she ran as fast as she could. It was like this unseen force inside of her that drove her as fast as she could away from this being. In that moment, she wasn't able to think or control her own body. It was like God took possession of her to save her and to take her far away from that being of evil. The retreat back to her house was a blur, but remembers being so full of fear and anguish that as soon as she got home, her father had awakened shortly before and was waiting for her return. She was just so happy to see her dad, and to be safe, she practically collapsed on the ground in tears. Her father wasn't so angry as he was worried, and she told him everything that had happened. Her sneaking back there, discovering the burial mounds, all of that. Her father told her that this is why he keeps her from there. There's an evil that lingers in that area from dark magic and negative energy. That is why it is important to never go back there. That was the event that dramatically changed the relationship between my grandmother and her father. He went from being overly protective and angry to a very deep, loving father. Her dad, after that event happened, told her about the evils and demons that exist to protect ancient secrets, rituals, and native practices of not only their people, but many tribes. They exist physically and spiritually. That is why we are supposed to stay away from them. I had asked her if her father addressed the kind of creature she saw, but she said no, he didn't. He did acknowledge that there are protectors of evil, as he called them, that guard and lie in wait, like whatever my grandmother saw. Those mounds that she saw go deep into the earth, where there is far greater evil. He never talked or explained further beyond that. At the end of the 6 years, he got into that car accident, lost his job due to paralysis, and ended up moving out of state with my grandmother until he passed away shortly thereafter. My grandmother, during those 6 years at that place, never ventured back further out where the creek was, and it really robbed her of her adventurous spirit for a while. The times that she had gone out there before were in the day. Why she had wanted to go out there in the early morning hours like she did was because she wanted to see just how active the evil spirits in that area were. It's almost like she had a sort of disbelief in her. She's not a Christian at all, so when I asked her questions about what she meant when she said that she felt like God grabbed her and sent her running, what that meant, it was this force that took over her and pulled her back in the direction of safety, she explained. It was almost impossible to describe, but said her mind was so overtaken by this horrible being approaching her. Deep down, if given the chance, she without a doubt in her mind knew that lizard thing was going to harm her in some way or another. Then she went on to tell me a whole other thing about when she was older, right after her dad had passed, that makes an interesting connection. She was in high school now, and had befriended a group of kids who were considered outcasts. Remember, this whole first encounter happened when she was about 11. Her dad had just passed, so she was very vulnerable and emotional. She had become heavily involved in witchcraft and dark magic through this small group of kids. They even formed their own unofficial coven. Most of her high school was spent furthering her magical abilities, casting new spells, and lingering on the darkness and hatred she now bared inside of her heart, and learning how to summon beings to do her work for her. Shortly after graduating, she had gotten to the point where these malformed, reptilian-like beings would come and visit where she was living. They would scratch on the windows and try to break in the house. All the while, she would cast spells that were supposed to banish them away. It only seemed to draw them in more and more. These beings my grandmother described looked different than the lizard-like being that she saw that came out of the burial mound hole. These were much more disproportionate, had long claws at the end of their hands and feet, and were more toothpick-like, even being taller than what she had seen when she was a child. Equally as frightening. The more and more she practiced, the more spells she would cast or try to hex somebody, the more these creatures would be drawn to her. She was filled with so much anger, hatred, and pain from her father's passing that witchcraft was the one thing that really took her away from it all. She was determined to control magic enough to where she could overcome anything, but she never did. When I asked her about the mentioning of trying to summon demons or beings to work with her, she explained that through spells, they were to obey her. She controlled them, and they worked only for her, the handler. The more and more she did, the worse it got. She never got to the point to where she had sacrificed humans, but her and her coven had blood sacrifices with several small animals that they would find, cats, dogs, etc., that didn't even go by any sort of religious textbook, like a satanic Bible, for example. They were just witches practicing dark magic in exchange for power from Satan. In turn, it drew a lot of bad energy to her life. Even though these alien reptile-like beings would torment her and try to get in her house, they never did. During my grandmother's early 20s, she had enough of that secret lifestyle and departed from that group of friends and witchcraft and denounced it altogether. She moved over to Kansas for a while for a career, and then on to Ohio, where she met her husband, who just passed away last year. Once she got rid of all her trinkets and witchcraft paraphernalia, spellbooks, etc., and stopped actively practicing, things stopped. And between the time that she had the encounter with the being out of the mound and the time she was in high school and started to practice dark magic, she never really thought about evil or the being she encountered being evil, even though she knew it was. She tells me how her leaving witchcraft was the thing that really cemented it into her, that the first reptile being she saw and these other ones that came to torment her were all cut from the same cloth. They had ill intent, and if possible, would have killed her. She knows this deep down. My grandmother is also agnostic, where I don't believe in any of that stuff. I know my grandmother is not lying about what she told me. She's just a sincere person, so I can't explain what her experiences were like. I just feel like for me, religion doesn't answer any of that. It's highly probable that the natives who built and constructed those mounds by that burial site practiced dark magic themselves. It was more common than we would know, but many hide it. Growing up, my grandmother knew several who practiced magic in secrecy, and that it went back hundreds and hundreds of years. Scores of them would get together in secrecy and worship the darkness, casting spells of protection and illusion, bindings on the burial sites for protection, wards to give off bad energy. It's a very serious part of their culture, a part of their culture that they don't talk about. It's very similar to what the Navajo people experience with what they describe as skinwalkers, people who have given themselves over to evil. It transforms them, even contorting somebody's body to a whole new being of darkness. My grandmother's take, which is an educated guess on what the mounds were, and that lizard being were evil beings assigned to protect that area. She knows this kind of thing exists in many other tribes and cultures. This is what she firmly believed her father had tried to keep from her and protect her, was this evil energy that laid there and waited. My two friends, best friend, my twin and I are playing in the woods, because we had nothing better to do that night. My friends were playing a game when we find the missing man. Basically, one person has a couple of minutes to hide, then the group attempts to find them, as if people have never played hide-and-go-seek. My best friend hid the longest, technically, because I didn't want to rat him out, because he's my best friend. So, me and him met back up, and decided to scare the rest of the group. So I started screaming, "Get it off," over and over again, hysterically. Nearly scared the rest of the group dead, because they were scared for me. We ended up getting a kick out of it, so we all went back to my house and grabbed some water and snacks. By then, it was about 11:55, so the group decided to go back out while I stayed, because I was bored of the woods. 25 minutes later, they come out scuttling and panting. They thought I was out there messing with them. They didn't tell each other what they saw. They all knew at the very least someone or something was following them. I asked what did they see. One friend said he thought I had a wolf mask that I was following them, and I would like squat or move towards whenever they shine the light that way. My twin said, yeah, I saw something out there, like the one friend described, but as they were headed. So I got excited because now I wasn't crazy at 8 years old. So we all went back out there to try and see it again. They both showed me where they saw it, and I asked where on the trail this happened. So we all ended up sitting quiet on the trail, hoping to see it for about 15 minutes. Instead, we got a blood-curdling scream. It wasn't a coyote, and we all know what they sounded like. The problem with it being a mountain lion is they don't. Their screams don't hold, and they don't sound like a woman. It lasted for 40 seconds. Just one big, deep, continuous scream. They asked what it was, or what it means. I said, that means it's time to get out of here. So we all ran out. By then it was getting later, so we all went out for a drive with my 5 of us in the car to get away and forget what we saw. We come back, it's like 1:20 in the morning. My friend dropped off my best friend, my twin, and I. 5 minutes later, my best friend got a snap that the two friends saw something on 2 feet, covered in fur, running in Kelly Myers. For my 18th birthday, I had gone up on a small road trip with my extended family, mainly my cousins on the East Coast, driving from Florida up to New York and back down. Years later, after I had my encounter, I came to find out that a man had seen close to the same thing I had when traversing through the same area. My encounter happened in 2009. We were in Lee County, South Carolina. I can't tell you what town we were close by because I don't remember. I can tell you that it was nighttime, and we were not just on the freeway. Even though we were on a road trip, My brother, who was driving at the time, insisted on taking all these back roads in every state to get a real feel for the area. This caused our road trip to take 10 times longer, which I didn't want. We had been driving through swamplands for the better half of an hour, not seeing a whole lot because it's dark and there are not many lights. If you're not familiar with the area, we're out in the middle of the swamps on a 2-lane road, just cruising in the summertime with the windows down. My brother, who's 21 at the time, pulled over slowly to the curb of the road. Not even a pull off, but slightly off to the side, and while keeping his foot on the brake in case another car came swinging in, told me to reach into the glove box. I did. He had brought several rolling papers and some weed. He was going to roll us some joints, and we were going to drive around smoking. But in that moment, as I'm handing him the stuff, we heard this strange screaming noise close by, closest to the driver's side of the car. It's pitch black out here, except for the stars and his headlights. There's not another soul on this road. Maybe 5 seconds later, after that scream, we hear this noise of something big coming toward the car. I don't know what it was, man, but out of the swamps to our left comes this freaky-looking gangly thing, coming straight for our car. It was almost gliding in motion, not at all like a physical animal running after something. Even though it made thudding noises as it moved forward, it looked so weird. Instinctively, my brother throws down the weed and swerves back onto the road while smashing the gas pedal all the way down. We were driving his crappy Volkswagen Jetta at the time, which, I remember, had a faulty knock sensor, so its acceleration was off. We go flying back on the road around this bend, and this creature, whatever it was, still hot on our tail, reaching its long arms out to try and grab a hold of the car. Everyone in the car is screaming, including me. Even though it's dark, we can see this thing. It had these yellow glowing eyes, almost white, unnatural looking eyes. Another car comes down the hill in front of us, and the thing chasing our vehicle hops off into the swamps to the right of the vehicle. My brother doesn't realize this yet, and he began losing control of the car. That's when he tried to stabilize the vehicle, ended up flipping the car because he was driving so fast. Luckily, we were all wearing our seatbelts, but it knocked me unconscious, along with my brother. I woke up later in the hospital with a mild concussion where my cousins had worse injuries than me. My brother somehow managed to avoid getting any drug charges because I guarantee you they found his stash in the car at the crash. I guess when each one of us gave identical recollections of the events leading up to the crash to the police and hospital staff, I think they just left it alone. Life ended up going on after that, but years later, my friend on Facebook sent me this thing about scape or swamp. This young man was over on the side of the road, and something that looked almost identical to what he described charged and tried to attack him. He got away, but by his accounts in the article of the paper, it's almost to a T what we saw. There's a rough sketch he did of the creature he saw, and it looked very much identical to that. It was also very, very fast. I have no idea what it was, but it really sent a chill down my spine to know that there had been somebody else who'd seen and experienced what we did. The best part was at least this young man was even documented by the newspaper. I tried reaching out to this man, who would be now 20 years older, to only learn that he had since passed away in a shooting. I don't know what's out there, and if you would have told me my own story before it ever happened, I'd call you crazy. Now, I'm a lot more open to people who have similar experiences as I do, and believe in things that the world says does not exist. Good day. What you are about to read is a warning. I beg you, I implore you, please do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know these woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet, as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for two reasons. One, animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are unknown to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife have fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And two, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So, naturally, I started making my way back towards my car, when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at the point that I'd been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid. But, thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I know those woods really well. But somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I'd managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic run through me. I did not recognize my surroundings, and I cannot understand how jarring that was for me, to be somewhere I'd been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just try to get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there was a ways around faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight, so that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That, or the moss in this area, grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm, told me there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I'd never ever seen in the woods before. Something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I'd spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I'd never seen anything like the old rundown cabin that stood before me. And I mean, it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built by any later than like 1979. So, just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anybody was home, and as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness. Maybe my blood sugar was low. I'm not entirely sure. But for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain. Leave this place and never return. Don't look back. Never look back. When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that every so often, the cabin did eventually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. Drew my attention. What I'm about to describe or attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind. A small statue sat atop of a stone altar. But, and I appreciate this is intensely confusing to read, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooded idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that. I ran like a scared child from that cabin and into the night. You read that right. When I walked into the cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes. At least, that's what it felt like. Only when I burst through the wooden door, it was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day, until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're reading this, heed my warning, and do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The scariest story I've ever heard was told to me by my grandfather. He was a soldier during the Second World War, enlisting on the day he had turned 18, March 3rd, 1944. The timing meant he missed the D-Day landings, as well as all the other horrors associated with it. But he arrived on the Western Front, just in time to take part in something arguably much worse, the invasion of the German homeland. Looking back, with the kind of 20/20 vision that hindsight gives you, it seems obvious that Nazi Germany was destined to lose the war, squeezed under the combined weights of the Allied and Soviet armed forces. But, in the moment, during the day-to-day fighting in the fields and forests of Northern Europe, the future seemed anything but certain. In fact, Germany was still convinced it could win the war. Using atomic bomb technology, stubborn defensive tactics, or a combination of the two, the Nazis were far from convinced that their fight was over. And it was into this new phase of war that my grandfather found himself, during a nightmarish push into the Nazi heartland that would prove just as terrifying as anything that had preceded it, if not more so. On the 2nd of October, 1944, the battle began. The city had been incorporated into one of the main defensive networks on Germany's western border, and the Allies hoped to capture it quickly before advocating into the industrialized basin to land the knockout blow to German manufacturing capabilities. However, a few miles south of the city lay a place known as the Hurtgen Forest. It was here that over 80,000 German soldiers were based, and the U.S. Army Task Force set into the woods intended to pin them down and prevent them from reinforcing the city. It's there that my grandfather's story occurs, so, without further ado, this is what happened to him. He and his platoon had been tasked with a routine patrol through the woods, probing for the German defensive line on which they could call in artillery and air support. It has been a quiet morning, but that calm was shattered when a distant rifle shot sent one of his platoon mates crashing into the dirt. The soldiers tried to find what little cover they could, but it took a few minutes before they could work out just which angle the shots were coming from. And in that time, 3 or 4 other Americans fell to that German sniper's bullets. A few men tried to tactfully withdraw under covering fire from their fellow soldiers. But the sniper picked them off before they could get away. Before long, the entire platoon was pinned down by the sniper, completely unable to move without being shot down where they stood. But as horrendous as that sounds, that's not the part that stuck with him. It's what came next. The platoon's radio man had been the one shot during the initial ambush and had bled to death pretty quickly. Lying lifeless in a sight clearing among the trees, anytime any of the soldiers tried to pull the man's radio unit to safety, the sniper would let off a shot, ensuring they kept their distance. One brave soul actually managed to get a hand on the radio, but through obscene skill, or just plain luck, the sniper managed to put a bullet through the upper section of the palm, basically blowing out his finger ligaments and rendering his hand useless. To their absolute horror, there was no way for any of them to call in artillery or air support. Effectively, more than 20 men were completely at the mercy of a one German sniper. My grandfather told me that on numerous occasions, a soldier might shift a little in place, maybe peek up to see if they could spot the sniper's firing position, and each time, the man would fall dead or scream out in pain as a bullet whizzed through the trees and found its mark. And each time the sniper fired and cut down another American in cold blood, he would laugh. He laughed so loud it would echo through the trees around them. My grandfather said that was the sound that he could never ever forget. Hearing the joy in that German sniper's laugh, the raw, violent delight he felt when his bullets struck home. Sometimes he would shout something, a phrase my grandfather could not understand, but had translated later on. More crying children. That sniper had my grandfather's platoon pinned down for about 6 full hours, but to him, it felt like days. They had to just lie there, perfectly still, as the dead, open eyes of their fallen comrades stared at them. Looks of shock and horror on their lifeless faces. At one point, the sniper, unable to spy any living targets through his high-powered scope, began to fire upon the dead in an attempt to break the platoon psychologically. My grandfather told me the entire platoon winced in disgust and terror as a bullet smashed into a dead man's skull. He had bled out, leaning up against a tree, and was evidently still well within the sniper's sights. Of all the wounds and injuries my grandfather saw during the war, he told me head wounds were always the worst. Once the structural integrity of the human skull is compromised, be it by bullet or shrapnel, or from the blunt force of a rifle butt, a person's face changes shape. The first bullet that hit the dead man's skull practically split it in two, right down the middle. But nothing I can write out will do exact horrific manner in which my grandfather described it. I'd known that guy for months. I could recognize him in the dark, just from his gait. But now, I didn't recognize him at all. His eyes, way too far apart. He looked inhuman. But the sniper did not stop there. He laughed and laughed and laughed as he sent 2 bullets, then 3, then 4, sailing into the dead man's skull, pulverizing it until it was just a mess of broken bone and leaking brain matter. Eyeballs still connected by the optical nerve dangled from shattered eye sockets. I can't even imagine how traumatic that must have been for a kid who was only barely 18. I mean, he was still a kid, a child. I think back to when I was 18. I could barely handle seeing a paper cut, let alone seeing somebody's entire head explode. His platoon had to wait until nightfall to escape. They did so as barks echoed through the trees. Cowards, the German sniper called them, in between volleys of that perverted manic laughter. My grandfather said he still expected to be shot as they ran back the way they came, trying not to have a head-on collision with tree trunks as they did. One man was so terrified He actually did straight run into a tree, broke his nose, but just got up and kept running. Grandfather died last year, so I consider this a little tribute to a great man who went through terrible times. Rest in peace. During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in Texas, eastern Texas to be exact. In the past, he had leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time and mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and get closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans were to shoot guns, drink, and other things rednecks like us to do in the woods. Our first morning kept us busy, cleaning the cabin and moving all of our stuff inside. Around dinner time, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I'd do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it too hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, so I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make a wise decision. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So, he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be stoned. I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that he had just bought. The beers and smoke were broke out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by, and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what happened but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protests, nobody was buying it, and I eventually just cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger. In other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I'd seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice, and now it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence rose. My friend's dad had mentioned to him an owner of one of the surrounding properties had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land. So we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for him. 1 mile or so down on one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot, tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register. We were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike. This time even closer. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled out of there. This was a time just before the commodity and commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst part was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags, and such were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked all the weed the night before. Nothing was missing but a box of ammo, and strangely, my sleeping bag and a wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputies' minds that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property, for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeat my story of seeing somebody lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by this time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger, like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year, we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same, and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease was renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulp wood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do once or twice a year talk to my old college friend on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still has not been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called strangers seem to focus so much of his anger onto my friend. And perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there, waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago? 3 years ago, when I was down in South Florida, I'll never unsee what I saw walking into the mangroves. I was walking along a small sector of deserted beach, very close to the thick swamps and Everglades that opens up right into the ocean. This is one of the many spots of the state where fresh water and salt water clash. I was kind of in the thickness of the swamp, but at the same part in an open enough area where there was plenty of empty beach. As I continue walking straight, I'm looking ahead. It was far away from me, but I could still make out details to know this wasn't a man. Something on two legs, standing like a man, walking like a man, and moving like a man, walks out of the mangroves onto the sand, and its back is turned to me. It takes a few steps, and then stops like it was caught. I'm talking frozen mid-step. It turns its head and looks right in my direction. While keeping its head fixated on me, it bolts off into the swamps and mangroves in just a flash. When it had emerged out of the mangroves, I didn't see it at first. I thought it was just an animal, until it came out to a clear view. It was heading in the direction of the water before it noticed me. What it looked like to me was this large lizard man. It had what I guessed was a small tail on its backside. It looked dark, and its head was shaped like a lizard head too. I couldn't see any eyes or anything specific about its body or skin because I was walking far away. The movements looked natural, fluent, organic. There's no way somebody in a random suit was just walking around out here in the middle of nowhere. Not even a camera crew, nobody to prank me, no cameras, nothing. The speed in which it took off at, back into the Everglades, wasn't human either. It took 3 huge strides at breakneck speeds, and bam, gone for good. It scared me and shook me. I really don't know how to describe with words what it was. Florida is home to all sorts of crazy animals. Last thing I would ever imagine is lizard men. There was nobody else around me or near me for miles that I could see. This was kind of out there. Not exactly on a big popular Miami-style beach. This was very secluded. An area that you have to travel through some swamp to get through, but anybody can access it. It wasn't hard, just took about a 15-minute walk. I feel like writing this out is helping me get over it and understanding what I saw. Even though I can understand it, it's like my brain is having a hard time processing the reality of it. When you're told your entire life, things like this aren't real. Well, they sure are. And if you see one as I did, it can throw your whole world upside down. Now, I just need to work on getting over that and living with it. Thanks for being an outlet we can send our stories to and get these off of our chests. First off, this happened about 3 years ago. I live in rural Tennessee, farmland, small town USA. So, one night early fall, my friend called me and wanted help with his newborn calf. I told him sure, jumped on my dirt bike, headed over, and when I got there, he had done deliver the calf, but the calf's mother was freaking out, mooing a weird kind of sound. My friend said he was going to go lock her in the barn and would stay with the calf. So, I did, and he was gone not even 3 minutes. When I caught a nasty wet dog, dead animal smell coming from my right. It was putrid. I thought it was a great dead deer rotting nearby, but then I heard some branches break about 40 feet to my right. I thought great, now a bobcat or some dog was going to eat the rotting deer and make the smell much worse. But to my surprise, the smell moved. I'm like, what? Smells don't move. So I shined my light in the area and caught a glimpse of something black. It was a blur and moving so fast. I thought, oh no, a bear. But I have never seen a bear in these woods. Just then, I heard something to my left, and I turned towards the sound, shined my light in front of me, about 20 feet away, and what I can only describe as a werewolf, like right out of a horror movie. It was standing on 2 legs, glaring at me. My mind was thinking that this is not real, and can't be, but there it was, 7 foot tall easily. I'm 6'4", No small guy. 280 pounds. But this thing made me look small. It was sniffing the air, and it showed a mouth full of teeth. Then I heard a branch break from my right. I turned. Another one, but smaller, about 6 feet tall, standing on 2 legs, so I positioned myself so I could see both creatures when the bigger one freaked me out even more. It took its arm, pointed with a huge claw looking hands at me. I was truly terrified, and I remembered the newborn calf still hiding in the grass. So I reached down, pushed the newborn between my legs. The larger creature looked at me, shook its head like to say, "No, don't do that." Just then, I remembered I had my father's World War II Colt 45 he had passed down to me, so I pointed it at the larger creature, thinking I'm going to get one shot in before I die, but I was going to go out fighting. Just then, the larger creature made a weird clicking sound. It hurt my head, made my eyes water, and to my relief, the larger one went to all fours and took off with the smaller one beside him. Like I said, it's been almost 3 to 4 years since my encounter. I never told anyone. I mean, who would believe you if you saw a real werewolf? I mean, you hear Bigfoot, but werewolves. Anyway, you can believe me or not. I truly don't care. I was browsing through your videos and saw you did a video on lake and sea creatures. After listening to it, I thought you might like to hear the story of a man that I used to be close friends with. I used to be close friends with a guy who managed a small team of recreational divers that would often go out on lakes and practice doing deep diving, compression stopping, and other things. Lake water is vastly different than the ocean, which is why this was more aimed at beginners looking to get their feet wet, literally, into diving, and the basics. The man's name, who I will mention, was named Earl. Earl had done many sea diving expeditions, but eventually transitioned to freshwater diving as he got older. I was good friends with the man. Very good friends, actually. Unfortunately, he decided to take his own life last year in March of 2019. I thought it would be good to share with what he shared with me. On one of his last, if not his last freshwater diving expedition, he and a couple of students went freshwater diving in one of the Great Lakes. I can't remember which one. Forgive me. I think it was Superior, but I can't quite remember. He claims to have been attacked violently by what he described as a part marine crocodile, part creature of the Black Lagoon. This man was not a fearmonger by any means and was a very honest person. He did not show fear of the water, and safety was his #1 mantra before diving. He knew the cons and knew the risks. This had scared him so bad that he quit his diving expeditions altogether entirely. Because we were so close, he was one of the few people he had talked about what he had seen that day, saying they were exploring part of the bottom, using specialized metal detectors for treasure hunting when this thing came out of a pocket at the bottom and nearly ripped his leg right off his body. Had he not moved just in time, it would have. It followed him closely to the surface as he retreated in fear, grabbing onto him and trying to drown him. It gashed at his back several times just trying to grab onto him and pull him down. Upon getting back up on the boat, he required severe medical attention immediately. His wounds were not life-threatening, but did require stitches from bleeding out and possible infection. I wasn't made aware of this until probably 4 months after the incident happened in the summer. He told me briefly what I just told you above, and that was that. I didn't want to push for more details than necessary, because he seemed so shook about the experience that he had. That's when he told me he was done diving altogether, and he could have really endangered the lives of his students and friends. I didn't hear from him much after that, only through text now and then, but it was still minimal, not like it used to be. The years prior, we would go out and do stuff together, like hiking, eating at good restaurants. Looking back at it, he actually never took me diving, to which I'm surprised it didn't happen. Everything happens for a reason, I guess. Then 2019 hit. I would reach out to him but not hear anything from him. And then March comes. I got a phone call from his girlfriend at the time, who called me and let me know that he hung himself the night previous. He had developed a strong drinking problem in the months prior to his death. I don't know if what happened to him on the last diving adventure had anything to do with him drinking and ending his life. I would like to think there's no connection. He never once talked about depression, and always seemed like a lively and active busy man. He would have been the perfect definition of not having enough time to be depressed. Tragedy aside, I felt it would be best if you knew his final diving account. I was walking down the fence line in the pasture, heading towards the corner where the fence went off to the left, towards the apartments, when I heard something large in the woods coming straight towards me, crashing through the brush, and sounded bipedal. It made me really curious because it was very thick woods and hard to walk through, and besides, that no one would ever went in that part of the woods except for me. These were like my woods. I called out, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And no answer. So I repeated it. Still no answer, yet they kept coming closer to me, till they got about 25 feet from me, and it made me mad, so I almost jumped over the fence and ran over there to see who was only 25 feet away from me and did not want to answer. But then I remembered that I had seen a man in his 40s with a long-barreled revolver on his hip across the creek coming from an area that had an abandoned barn. That area always gave me the creeps, so I just never went there. So I caught myself right before I jumped over the fence and said, "No, something does not seem right here." By this time, I was at the corner of the fence line, so I turned left and continued to follow the fence line towards my apartment. Then I heard bipedal steps of this, what I thought was a person, because 40 years ago, we did not believe in Bigfoot or anything like that. I stopped walking and it stopped. So I started walking again, and it also started walking along the side of me, about 25 feet from me. The woods are very thick here in Louisiana, so you cannot see through them. As I walked, I made sure my razor blade arrow was well notched, and never took my eyes off of who or what was walking parallel from me. And then it came to a part of the woods that I could never get through, because there was a different type of bush there, about 6 feet tall, and they were very, very sharp, and tried everything I could to get in there to get my bird, but could not crawl under it or go over it, and I was afraid not to go through the brush. I had scratched my left eye twice and had to get the top layer of skin removed by an eye doctor from going through brush in those woods. This thing started crashing through this brush as I started to walk very fast, and then I just saw for a split second a very, very tall black figure crashing through the stuff. It was solid black, maybe 10 feet tall. It had to be huge to step over the top of these 5 to 6 foot tall bushes. I could see them from about the chest up. It had its arms in the air and out in front of it, and its torso leaned forward, but I did not see any cloths, which I thought was weird. That's when it hit me. It was not a man. This was something else. I had no idea what it was. All I saw was a black silhouette type of figure. I took off running, and it did also, and paralleled me all the way to the parking lot. When it reached a large tree right there next to the parking lot, it sounded like it started smashing and snapping large tree limbs from the tree, like maybe 4 to 6 inches in diameter. I jumped the fence and ran right into my apartment, which was facing the woods by about 50 to 75 feet away. I was hesitant to bring this story and even tell anyone about it due to the weird nature of it. But I see others are sharing, and I'm hoping somebody could have I have an idea of what this could be type of answer for me. Little background. I am originally from New Zealand. I was a horse trainer and lived literally at the foot of the mountains. I know all different wildlife and can say I've had no fears of ever walking at night through the woods. Have lived my whole life doing this with no issues whatsoever. I come to the U.S.A., and my husband knows how much I love the woods, So he takes me on my first trip to Mount Hood. He decides to surprise me with staying in a random off-beaten path place. It's legal to be here, but it's not a campsite or anything. Imagine a 7-hour drive and not seeing a car or soul for about 2 to 3 hours. That's just how far into the woods we were. So we set up, I take a walk around the entire place. First time in American woods, and I am bloody excited. I go chop some wood for a fire and splash around in the river, 6 feet from where our campsite is. Afternoon turns to late afternoon, and we both take a walk along the winding river. Forest is thick, mostly something like pine trees, but you can see space in between. We sit to chat and enjoy the silence. Dead silence, I may add, which I have never heard before. Then, my husband says, "Don't look behind you." I say, "What?" "Don't say that. That's like a horror movie line to scare people." He said, "Let's get out of here. I just saw something watching us from a tree." I look, and we heard 2 feet running like lightning, and I saw a tall shadow, but that's all I saw. I said, "What was it? Was it a man?" And he said it stood up like a man. So it was maybe some pervert watching us. Maybe a criminal hiding out here. I thought that it was bloody weird. Who would be out here just peeking at us from the tree? It felt wrong, but I did not question him. We got back at the tent, and I couldn't let it go. The logic of a single man being out here, just stalking us, and then bolting off like lightning speed, just didn't make any sense. So I decided to investigate and see if anyone was around. I told him I needed to do something, and he said, "Yell if you need me." I found claw marks in the dirt, and the size was of a dinner plate. I saw them next to some type of poo. I'd never seen poo that big, or so weird looking that I couldn't identify. I found no evidence of anybody in the area, and I even did a 20-minute walk, foot, along the road, seeing if anybody was camping out like where we were. Nothing. Not a soul. Not even one car drove past. So weird. I thought maybe he saw a bear, then didn't worry too much about fighting after no humans around. Go back to camp, made some tea, and was sitting, looking at the river with the thick woods to my back. I started getting very dark and death-type feelings, like something is watching me. Then this idea flowed through me that something is going to kill me, stalk me, then attack me once darkness falls. It was like something was laughing at me, about it like it was funny. Weird to say this, but this is what it felt like. It was terror, like nothing that could ever be imagined. I was sweating now, and absolutely terrorized. As this feeling felt so real, I kept looking in the direction this feeling seemed to be coming from, which was from that thick wooded area behind me, and I could not see a thing. I got it so bad I could not function normally and told my husband. He laughed and said I was just a Kiwi and didn't know American woods. I said, like hell, mate, something is planning to kill me out there, and I could feel it watching me 24/7. I asked him if a bear could be emanating its ideas to me, and he said that's not usual for animals to do. Maybe I'm just not used to the deep woods. He didn't believe me, so he just looked at my face and faced the woods. If you feel the need, I have a gun, so you won't need to worry. Then when he mentioned the gun, some weird emotional feeling came at me saying, "A gun won't stop me. Nothing can save you if I choose to get you." Now this is why I have never told anyone, because this sounds bloody crazy, I know. But there was something sending me real, dark vibes telepathically. I knew it wasn't me. I'm literally at this point like a crack addict, looking left and right, and left again, planning to see the thing when it comes at me. Nothing happened, and then darkness fell over us. I'm listening, but it's dead silent. I can't even hear little bugs making sounds. I can't take the suspense, so I go to the tent, and my husband is still laughing. He joins me 20 minutes later, gives me a hug, and realizes I'm feeling like death is coming. He hugs me and drifts off to sleep. I get that vibe again, and it's like it's playing a game with me to make me more scared. I know something is out there, and then I hear walking to the tent, and I am making gateway plans in my head, when I hear breathing at the tent right by my head. I see nothing because it's pitch black, but there is silence, Dead silence, so I could hear something outside my tent, right by my head. I freeze and cannot breathe. I am too scared to move my hand to grab my husband's hand, because I know if it hears anything, we're dead. Then boom! It hits the tent, and the entire thing shakes. My husband startles awake. He gets mad at me, thinking I did this to scare him. I said it's not me. There is something out there. He hears the sound like a big old buffalo breathing, as if it had smoked for 30 years. He finally believes me and whispers, "I'm loading the gun." Then movement hitting into the tent again. He said, "Okay, this is serious. If it happens again, this thing breaks in, you run, and follow the river upstream, and I will stay and fight it off with a gun. Give you a chance to escape." Something moves, and as soon as my husband grabs the gun and makes that loading sound, there is silence again. We do not sleep after this. I am alert like hell, and morning finally comes, and I go outside and see claw marks in the dirt and dinner plate size again with this huge pile of weird poop, and I think, is this a monstrous bear? And it can send feelings to me in my mind? But then my husband says that I've never seen bear prints that big, and it could have been a Kodiak or giant grizzly just passing through. We were both so shaken, we packed up and ran like hell out of that place. Sorry it was so long, but can anyone just tell me if they think this was a big bear? Do bears send feelings like this to your mind telepathically? I'm pretty sure I've never heard of this before, but I am also not an American native. This had bothered me for years because I've never had a force of emotion come over me like this that has totally crippled my emotions and body. I feel like I can't rest until I know what this was. I've been wanting to tell my story for some time, but I have held back because it's so crazy. I've had to convince myself that I'm not crazy, and I was not hallucinating. Let me give you some backstory before I get into the nitty-gritty. This was in May of 2015. I was with my ex-girlfriend at the time, and we were driving down the coast of Washington, Oregon, and down into California, all along Highway 101, which travels down the coastline of these 3 states. One of our favorite things to do is to go out onto the beach at nighttime. We have done this more than once, had no problems ever, with bums, police, anything. Nobody ever gives us problems. There's just something so enticing about the moonlight shining out over the vast empty ocean with nobody around and the tide continuously rising. It's a beautiful experience. At the time, I believe we were in Southern Oregon. I can't tell you what beach or by what town because I don't know. We just pulled off to a spot in a spontaneous moment. We just pulled off the side of the road to a spot that had beach access, grabbed our blanket and our hoodies, and ran off into the beach to watch the tide come in. Luckily for us, there was still plenty of space for us to sit and watch the night sky. Even better, it was a clear night with a bright moon illuminating the night sky, paving this out-of-this-world landscape. My favorite thing about night adventures on the beach is that there's nobody else around, so that was truly something. We get set up with our blanket and we sit down to start cuddling and talking about how beautiful the beach is. It's windy as can be, which is why we wore our hoodies. I don't think there's a beach in the world that isn't windy. We were just watching the waves crash onto the shore, making small conversation. Maybe 10 minutes go by, and my girlfriend is like, "Hey, let's build a fire and roast some marshmallows." We had some kindling and firewood in the back of the car that we kept for such occasions. She wanted me to go run and get it. It didn't take much convincing. I was agreeing. After a quick kiss, I started to get up when both of our attention just happened to be pulled out in the distance where we saw this shape climb out of the sand. It happened so fluidly and quickly. To make it easier to understand, this is exactly what my girlfriend, whom I talked to later about it, and verified we saw the same thing. A person, a pitch black figure, climb their way out of the sand and run towards the water, reached the water, and continued running into the water, not even fazed by the oncoming waves, until they were fully submerged underneath the waves, and never came back out. I hadn't even stepped off the blanket yet when my girlfriend and I in unison rush up, grab our blanket, and head back to the car in total fear. We get the car started and we got out of there, flying down the highway. We didn't say a word for probably a half an hour, maybe longer. I was the one to break the silence with asking her what she saw, where she calmly explained to me, I don't know how, but she did, what I had just typed to you. I knew as soon as she told me that I wasn't hallucinating. We were not under any substance, alcohol, weed, nothing. 100% sober, not sleep deprived, no pills, nothing. This was maybe 50 feet away from us. This figure, which was totally pitch black, ran out onto the sea, continued going until fully submerged. What? Why? Even in the dim lighting that the moon provided, had it been a person, we would have seen colors of clothing, or some sort of shape. But this, it was just the silhouette of a person. There was no defining extra shapes like clothes on them or anything. It was super creepy. Then for this figure or person to run not only into the water, but into it until fully underneath by the waves. We were seriously mind-screwed. We debated and talked about it for hours afterwards, speculating what it could have been. I think my girlfriend at the time concluded that we saw a ghost of a sailor who had died and was running back to sea. I don't believe in that. Besides, why would a ghost interact with our world like that? Literally digging their way out of sand like it did in full view of us and running into the water. It wasn't some transparent apparition either. That's my super creepy night experience at the beach. Make of it what you will, but I promise I'm not crazy. We both saw this, and we can both testify to this day that this is truth. This story was told to me by my brother. It occurred during the early 2000s. Smartphones had not yet been invented. Only shitty flip phones with sketchy cellular service. My brother was an electrician, a journeyman. He was employed in a smaller border town called Gallup, New Mexico. Gallup is situated on the cusp of the Navajo Nation res, in the area called the Checkerboard area, due to the fact that there are designated plots of land that are considered a part of the res, and the next plot of land is not, like a checkerboard. There is large population of multiple tribes in area, such as Navajo, Pueblo, etc. One night, my brother and one of his coworkers, who was Chinese American, were the only two employees on call, in case of emergencies. A power line goes down or something catastrophic happens like that in the middle of nowhere, outside of Gallup, towards the Continental Divide. He receives the call in the early morning hours, shortly after 1 a.m. The coworker had recently become a father of a newborn, but desperately needed the hours. My brother calls him, and they agree to meet up at the company's stockyard. My brother waits about an hour or so. His coworker still hasn't shown. It is strict company protocol to never go on jobs alone, always in pairs or more, due to the hazardous nature of high voltage lines and electricity in general. My brother's coworker calls and tells him that something is wrong with the newborn and he needs to take his wife to the ER, and he'll meet up with him on site. Also, another injunction. They are strictly instructed to show up to the job site in company vehicles, which are equipped with tools required for the job and all that. My brother understands and doesn't want his coworker to be docked pay or written up for the violation of company policy. Against his better judgment, he heads out alone. The job site is quite literally in the middle of nowhere. The power lines spanning across the vast desert with red rock mesas in the far distance. In the daylight, at least. At nighttime, it is pitch black New Mexican desert. Only dirt roads and no houses or streetlights for miles. None could be seen along the entire horizon. He waits as long as he cares to wait for his coworker. He figures he'll assess the damage on his own, and by the time his coworker shows up, he'll have a solution. He suits up and begins crawling the tall wooden pole. The company truck is parked facing towards the pole. The high beams illuminated the base and subsequent foreground. He reaches the top of the pole. Some time passes as he is trying to calibrate the issue or solve the problem, the power outage. Something on the ground below him catches the corner of his peripheral. He looks down in disbelief and shock as his mind tries to make sense of what he is seeing. He described it as a man crawling on all fours, wearing the skin of a coyote. The skin draped along its back, with limbs like dead weights dangling towards the ground. He watches as the creature patrols the area. He said he witnessed the skinwalker encircle the truck with smaller and smaller orbits, until eventually it stood up on 2 feet and peered inside the window of the truck on the driver's side. He described the motions of the skinwalker and said it was moving as if it was confused as to what was going on, where the driver of the truck was. From his vantage point, he could infer that the skinwalker was male, was painted with black paint and white clay. Then, on the horizon, he saw headlights. His coworker was en route. The skinwalker also noticed this, not figuring out that he was up on the power line pole. As his partner approached closer, the skinwalker ran off into the dark on all fours. The rest of the trouble call was uneventful in regards to the skinwalker. When I was a teenager, I had a few experiences with some kind of creature. I'm not saying that it was an upright canine or a Sasquatch, or really anything else, because I honestly don't know what it was. I'll give you the details, though, and you can come up with your own conclusions. All I know is whatever it was huge and stalking me, and was massive on a scale of 8 to 9 feet tall. Perhaps there was a huge football player running around the woods near my house. I don't know. But the story still gives me the chills to this day, and is the reason why I never keep my windows open at night anymore, or ever open my blinds except during the daytime. These events happened nearly 15 years ago, back when I was just a teenager. I came from a small town in rural Northern California called Paradise. It was a beautiful, safe community, where kids like myself could go out at night without fear of getting kidnapped. A place where almost everybody knew everyone else, and the town was incredibly tight, with a lot of local traditions. We had things like Golden Nugget Day, where we would hold a massive parade through town and celebrate that one of the largest golden nuggets found in America was discovered right there in our hometown back in the 1800s. We had celebrations to remember our roots to the apple farms that once grew all over the ridge, and we would cook apple pies and sell them in our downtown park. We even filled all the main streets with American flags during the 4th of July every year, where on both sides of the street, you would see massive flags for miles and miles. The town was a pristine, beautiful community that was nestled right in the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Unfortunately, the town no longer exists, as it burned down last year in a massive fire on November 8th, 2018. So even if you wanted to send somebody to investigate my claims, all you will find, unfortunately, will be ruins of a once thriving community of nearly 50,000 and endless mountains scarred by flame where forest once stood. But all the events that happened to me are true. As beautiful as the town was, I always had this dread about the forest. I lived across the dam in a suburb of Paradise called Magalia. Just behind my house was an old forest that we called Dogtown. From what I know, there wasn't anything nefarious or Dogman related in regards to the name, but the name is as old as the town, and considering my family lived there for 7 generations, the reasons for the name I'm sure have been lost to time. My father used to tell me that Dogtown got its name because some old lady once owned a lot of dogs in the area. Another legend has it that it was what they once called an old Native American tribe that once lived in the region. There were other stories as well, but honestly, I don't give any of them merit, because the honest truth is that's just a name. Those woods always gave me the creeps. I'm not sure why, honestly. Probably the legends the school children used to tell each other about how teenagers died on the road once by seeing something they shouldn't have seen, and it deformed all their faces. Learned later in life this never happened. But even after I got a car, I didn't like driving the long way through Dogtown unless I had to during day or night. I never drove the road at night. I was always too afraid to do so. Near Dogtown, there was once a river that had been turned into an artificial lake by a dam. There aren't any houses or anything there, just the water in the dam, but it's a perfect spot for anything to live if they needed food, water, and shelter from the environment due to the thick, tall canopy of trees. The backyard of my house led to this forest, and the town in general was built in the forest itself, which led to an abundance of wild creatures. From bears to mountain lions, and deer were always walking around our house. When I was 15 or 16, I started playing video games fairly late on my computer during the summer. And when I say late, I mean like 2 or 3 in the morning sometimes. I was pretty addicted to one game in particular and stayed up hours playing it. Unfortunately, nearly my entire life, I've always had this curse that for some reason, the air conditioning doesn't get to through the vents. I now live in Florida and have the same issue with this new house. It's a wicked curse. In California, this wasn't too much of an issue at night because the nights were always so wonderfully cool. I would just leave my bedroom window open and the cool air would come in, right in. I had been doing this for a while with no problems and didn't see any need to close my window when I went to bed. That is, until one night when I began to hear it. I'm going to guess it was around 1 to 2 in the morning that night, and I only had gone to bed shortly prior. I was already mostly asleep when I heard a really weird noise that woke me. It was like a screaming yowling that was the mixture of a screaming baby and that of a cat. Now, I've heard mountain lions my entire life, and I know they can sound like a screaming woman and make all sorts of strange noises. This wasn't like that. It's very hard to explain the sound, but closest sound I could say was that of a dying cat, child, or something. At first, I just felt it annoying and assumed that it was just some stupid cat having sex down the street. But the sound kept finally getting louder and louder as whatever it was walked down the street toward my house. Finally, I got annoyed and creeped out enough to where I closed my window and quickly fell asleep. I didn't think of it the next day because it wasn't that big of a deal. That is, until it came back the second night, and the night after that, again and again, repeating always between midnight and 3 a.m. The first week this happened, it only annoyed me, but after about 2 weeks of this creature constantly walking down my road at the same time every night, screaming its head off and always heading toward my house, I started to not like it at all. I tried peering into the darkness to see if I could see anything in the street, but I never could. I couldn't make out any figures or shadows in the darkness, and I never got to see what it was that was making those yowling noises. The part that freaked me out the most was that every night it would come to as close to the area across the street from my house, and that is where it would stop. I felt like it was watching me, and I had no idea what it was, and my young mind was going through wild thoughts of a crazy demon cat creature trying to eat me through my window. So eventually, I just stopped opening my window. I kept it closed, and soon after, the issue had stopped. It had been about 3 weeks after that, and I had no problems at all. I no longer heard the sounds, and I was no longer hiding in the darkness, trying to find out whatever it was that was terrorizing my neighborhood. I'd asked my parents if they have ever heard anything, but since they took sleeping meds, they never woke up to anything at all. So I was completely alone with my knowledge of what was happening at night. Eventually, my fear subsided, and I forgot about the screaming beast thing because I hadn't heard it in such a long time. And then, things totally got a lot stranger and freakier. My bed was located against the window in my bedroom, with the head located directly underneath it. When I would sleep, the window would be located right above my head. One night, for whatever reason, I left my window open again. I'm not sure what woke me up that night, but I don't remember hearing anything. In fact, it was completely silent, both inside the house and outside. I just remember waking up and looking up and seeing nothing but darkness. Usually some light of the moon, stars, and lights from the neighbor's porch would come through my window a bit, but this time, there was just absolutely nothing. Just pitch black. I was still mostly asleep at this point and closed my eyes to go back to sleep. That is when it hit me, what I had just seen, and I jumped out of my bed faster than I ever had before and was looking right out over my window, terrified. I couldn't really make it out, but what I did see was a massive shadow covering the side of the window where my head was that was quickly moving to the right out of view. I thought I was just dreaming, but then our motion sensor light turned on, and I knew somebody had been watching me in my sleep. I ran and woke up my dad, and he grabbed the gun. He ran outside the house, but unfortunately, he didn't see anything at all. My dad thought I had just imagined it and didn't really believe me, but I know what I saw. It was a massive silhouette of a man-shaped creature that was so tall, it went all the way to the top of my window, and even a tad bit higher. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see if it had a muzzle, or if it was flat, because it was so dark. I couldn't see if it had a tail or ears. I couldn't even tell if this thing was a man, or if I saw a Bigfoot or Dogman. All I know is that somebody very, very tall was absolutely right there watching me while I was sleeping, only a mere foot away from my face. I never opened my window at night again, and to this day, I always keep my blinds closed and windows closed at night, even though I live in the suburbs of a city now. That wasn't the end, however. Although I never heard the yowling outside my window again, and I never did see another creature peering through my bedroom window, because I kept my blinds and windows closed, I did experience more later on. I think it was about a few months later that I was hanging out with my friend outside the front of my house in our driveway. My parents weren't home, and so it was just me and her, and it was about 11 or 10 p.m. at night. She and I both heard this screech nearby from the woods, and it freaked us both out, which is when she decided it was a good time for her to go home. At this point, I was home alone, again, in my kitchen. The kitchen is set up as an open floor plan into the living and dining room area, and a huge floor-to-ceiling sliding glass door in the dining room, which was clearly visible from the kitchen. I called my friend on her phone to chat with her while she drove home. This was during a time when driving and talking was legal still, and that is when a massive bang slammed against the back sliding glass door of my dining room. I jumped maybe a foot off the ground and dropped the phone as I spun to look out the door. I couldn't see anything because the only lights that were on were the inside house lights, not the back porch light. I dropped to the floor completely terrified at this point. It literally sounded like somebody drop-kicked my back door. I picked up my phone and I told my friend what had happened, as I was going to try and see what it was. Just as I was raising my head to see if I could see anything, an even larger slam hit my front door this time. This is how I know it wasn't just an owl or some deer accidentally running into the window. It first happened on the back door, and then whatever it was had to run to the front and then pound on the door as well. I was beyond scared at this point and ran to my bathroom and locked myself in there until my parents came home. Anyway, those are the scariest events that happened to me while I was there. I didn't see anything, and for all I know, was pranked or was being stalked by some really big guy. I know this story is probably a lot more disappointing than you thought it would be, and you are hoping for an actual visual sighting of something, more than just something pounding on my doors and windows and screaming at me. But honestly, these events freaked me out a lot. Enough that I've changed my behavior, even to this day, where I'm now 31. When I was 7 years old and camping at a lake with my family, I was swimming alone in the water when I saw what I believe was a lake monster. It was so large that it was easily 3 times bigger than I. It had a massive head, dark red skin, and huge long fins at its side. It had teeth that were long and pointed, as sharp as knives. I screamed like a little girl. It slowly inched closer and closer to me. I yelled to my family and I swam for my life. I couldn't believe it. I was so frightened that I swam as fast as I could back to my mother and father at shore. My parents were screaming at me, knowing I was in danger. My dad, bless his heart, in his full non-swimming clothes, jumped in head first and swam towards me to rescue me. He gets me and pulls me out of the water. I'm hyperventilating, and I'm trying to explain what I just saw. I was worried that being 7 years old, they wouldn't take what I had to say very seriously. Well, they did to an extent. My mother tried to explain it by saying I just saw a big fish, but I told her this one was going to eat me. Looking back, it kind of reminded me of some sort of crocodile, maybe a freshwater crocodile, but I ain't ever seen a crocodile that looked anything like this did. This occurred at Lewisville Lake in Texas. You know what they say, everything is bigger in Texas, even the lake monsters and carnivorous fish. First, I'd like to say that I never saw anything and only heard something. It happened over 2 years ago. Not sure exactly when, but I think it was in February, maybe on Valentine's Day. I was riding a bike down this road. No sidewalks unless you're in the city where I live, and I was about to get to this bridge where there's this lake pond thing. There was this house to my left. There were multiple houses on both sides of the road it was on, and around the area were more houses in rows, similar in spacing to a suburb. But there were some woods behind the houses, and further behind them was even more woods. As I was riding, I heard what sounded like a mix of maybe a cow and a woman screaming. It didn't sound like a moo scream thing exactly. I don't know why, but something about the way it sounded made me think of a cow. Although, thinking about it now, I don't really know what made me think it sounded like a cow. It was definitely animal-like, mixed with a woman's scream though. While I was riding, it only sounded like a scream. I'm not sure how I had heard it with my wind in my ears, but I had stopped to listen. Normally, I would just keep to myself and not try to save anybody. For some reason, I felt like I needed help if somebody was in trouble. I waited to see if I heard anything, and I heard the weird sounding scream this time. Once, a little bit later again, it sounded like it was roughly from the backyard area of that house or in the woods area behind it. I decided I was going to stay there a bit longer and go check it out. If I heard another scream or stop a car, if one came, and asked them to come with me or call the police since I didn't have service with the phone that was with me. It was probably 3 to 4 a.m., maybe. Super dark, so I definitely didn't want to go and help anyone, especially since if anything at all, I had a pocket knife. I didn't hear another scream. I am doubtful about it being a skinwalker. I imagine it would have tried to lure me, or more than just that. Maybe say something else, if possible. Not sure of the limitations of their voice mimicking. And it also wasn't super loud either in comparison to where it was originating from. The two screams sounded similar, but they weren't loud enough for me to say for sure. At the time, riding at night was beautiful and relaxing. Although if I knew about skinwalkers then, I probably wouldn't have went out that night alone like that. I live in the southern area of the U.S. Not sure if there's anything to be worried about living out here, or what the statistics or chances of encountering a skinwalker is. Just wondering what people's thoughts were, and if anyone agrees it probably wasn't a skinwalker. Although I don't really know what it could have been. If I did suspect it, it was a skinwalker in the situation. I would have definitely noped out of there though. Hello, my name is Caden. I am from a Navajo branch and a firm believer in skinwalkers. This is the story of how I saw a skinwalker. I was 10. I was staying with my sister, my friend, and her family during the summer. We were in Leavenworth, Washington. We drove to see her cousins. They had a huge house. It was up in the mountains and was like a log cabin. It had a large back property and even a creek with a river. I was always introverted, so I was outside while most people were inside. They had a small hanging bench about 5 feet away from the creek, and I was sitting there, lost in thought. My friend's uncle was working in their chicken coop. about 100 yards away. I snapped out of my thoughts when I heard my name being called. Her uncle didn't know my name. She never introduced us, but she said he was her uncle. He wasn't biological. He was married, her mom's sister, so my friend isn't a native. He is. His son is. I heard my name, called, and looked up. I saw what I thought was a buck in the woods staring at me. Why is it staring at me? I thought. I waved at it for my own entertainment, but felt chills when it smiled at me. Its teeth were rotted and human-like. As I looked into its eyes, a foul stench filled the air. The thing had glowing eyes. It smelled like pot and decaying body. It stood on its hind legs. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. It had flesh missing in some places missing fur. My name was called again. I noticed that it came from the direction of the thing. I took a step forwards and was now about 75 yards from me. It took another step forward, and it screamed. Her uncle had a hunting rifle hanging up in his shed, which was next to the coop. He grabbed it and ran over to me. I looked at him as he looked at it. He raised the gun and shot. The thing ran off, and he asked if I knew what that was. I asked if it was a buck, and he said no. It's a skinwalker. They are dangerous and can harm you. Do not ever go near one. If you see one again, understand? He asked, and I nodded, and we walked back. Do not speak of this, he said before returning to the coop. About 30 minutes later, we left. I swear, on the dark, empty road back to her house, I saw the same glowing eyes staring back at me. This is a personal story and experience. Let me start by providing a few details to establish the backstory. I have contemplated whether or not to reveal this story since the day it happened. According to Navajo kinship, your cousins are legitimately considered your sisters and brothers, depending on their gender, of course. So, forgive me if the term cousin brother seems a bit janky. I grew up next door to my cousin brother, who was less than a year my senior. We did everything together. In high school, he became a popular basketball player, but mediocre academic. You know that old song and dance? He was a light-skinned Navajo, clear complexion, athletic, very handsome and popular, etc. I was enrolled into kindergarten a year after he was due, my late birth date, making him a junior, 11th grade, and myself a sophomore, 10th grade when the story occurred. If you come from the res, you know how important basketball is. You're basically a celebrity. Going to high school on a dry res usually meant that getting alcohol was very, very difficult. So, even in high school, parties were very limited in terms of alcohol consumption, meaning no one built up a strong alcohol tolerance. Everybody was a lightweight because the drinking was infrequent, and even when alcohol was available, you had to return to your parents' home, so most people stayed relatively sober. Our older sister was attending university off the res and invited both us brothers out for her upcoming spring break. Our spring break was 2 weeks, and during our second week of break, her spring break would commence. Therefore, during our 2-week visit to her campus apartment, she was in class the first week, leaving us to our own devices. He quickly made friends with some people our sister introduced him to, and began going to parties almost every night. I went to a few, but left early on most occasions. I didn't drink or smoke during high school. One day, while my sister was in class, I slept past 1 p.m. Being a teenage boy, it wasn't hard, and my brother stumbled into the apartment from the party he attended the night before. He was very intoxicated. The kind of heavily intoxicated that you can smell the alcohol coming out of his pores, and the smell of alcohol lifting off his bad breath and clothes. He finds a handle of vodka that was chilling in the fridge and begins drinking that. It isn't long before he is crying and having a complete meltdown. To this day, I still get chills thinking about what came out of his mouth that late afternoon. He was basically crying and almost incoherent, but was adamant that he needed to get something off of his chest and confess something. I'm there listening, but still a bit annoyed because I was left to babysit him. I figured he was going to say he was cheating on his girlfriend, or got arrested last night, or something frivolous. This is not verbatim what he said, but the gist of his confession. He begins to confess that he is a skinwalker. I tell him to shut up and that he's just messed up. He gets angry because I am not listening correctly. His angry outburst spurs me to longer interference and to just listen to what he has to say. He repeats himself and says, "I am a skinwalker. I killed my paternal grandmother." He continues to say that around the time we were in junior high, which is 7th and 8th grade, is when he began practicing bad medicine to become a skinwalker. I don't remember if I asked for an explanation in pure disbelief or what, but he continues to say that one summer evening, when he was out after dark, shooting hoops alone, a skinwalker was watching him from the roof of an empty hogan. By empty hogan, I mean a vacant hogan, uninhabited by any family members, but was centrally located and used solely for ceremonial purposes. Blessing way ceremonies, prayers, and puberty ceremonies, aka good medicine. Under the one streetlight, the stage is set. The ball ricochets off the rim and rolls past the hogan. He runs after it frantically, trying to pick up the basketball before it rolls into bullhead stickers. He said it was then that he noticed he was being watched. He said he saw the man. He said man with no further inclination of a name or who the man was in relation to him, crouched on all fours, and then crawling around the hogan roof following him. The man offers to teach him to become powerful and successful just like him. I can only summarize that being young and impressionable without thinking of consequence is what launched him down a path of bad medicine. He stumbles over his own words and key details. He then admits that there is an irrefutable trade. Someone he loved dearly must be sacrificed or exchanged for power. At some point, he looks me in the eyes and says something to the effect of, "Didn't you ever notice as kids I was always missing a lot or not around?" He confides in me that the man, his skinwalker teacher, would come during the night and take him away to teach him. To where, I have no clue. He never said. I refute his claim. At the risk of him having another angry outburst, I was trying to keep his volume low because I didn't want the campus security to show up and our sister to get in trouble, that he murdered his paternal grandmother. She was killed in a vehicular accident. A semi-truck hit her vehicle straight on. She died instantly. I tell him it was an accident. He said him and his teacher performed evil chants and bad medicine, causing the accident to happen. That was his final test and subsequent initiation. I believe during all this, he was blacked out. He passes out eventually before my sister returns. I never tell her. We leave him in the apartment and go hang out with her friends. He wakes up the next day, not remembering anything and acting like nothing ever happened. Growing up traditional, I was told all my life that by elders and my parents, who were told by medicine men that if a skinwalker reveals their identity or their identity becomes known, they will get sick and die. This thought haunted my mind for a long time after this. I believed that my cousin would get terminally ill or become a fatality in a car accident for revealing everything he revealed. To be honest, I thought that his skinwalker pack or clan, or whatever you want to call them, would retaliate and start casting bad medicine on me for even knowing. Weeks become months, and months become years. Nothing happens. To this day, my cousin's brother is healthy and still handsome with a small family of his own. We aren't as close anymore. I wouldn't say estranged because there was no falling out or bad blood. I went to college and came back a different person. Why didn't anything happen to him? Maybe he was lying, but why would his story be as detailed as it was, even as a blacked out drunk? Why would a normal person want to admit to killing their loved one? I don't know the answer to any of these questions. I heard this story from my sister's coworker and trusted friend of many years. They've known each other since kindergarten. In small rural reservation communities, it is not uncommon to know somebody throughout your lifetime due to limited choices of schools. You basically go to school with the same generation of kids from kindergarten until you graduate high school. This story isn't as detailed or in-depth as many other stories that people have shared with me, because my sister's friend explained it very nonchalantly and quickly in passing. Anyway, my sister tells her friend to tell the story to me. It takes her a moment of contemplation to share it. She said that her cousins, who are twin brothers, were always fearless ever since they were kids. They were hard to scare and would never cry or show emotion as far back as she could remember. She continued to say that they would always play freeze tag and kick the can outside after the sun went down, even though their grandma would tell them not to. They would spend the night on the trampoline with no tent, just sleeping bags during the summer. They live out towards Spider Rock when the pavement turns to dirt road. That dirt road becomes 3 Turkey and eventually Old Sawmill Road. For a few weeks, something kept coming up into the family's property, causing the dogs to howl and bark and the cattle and sheep to get flustered and frantic. It started to get the brothers annoyed and territorial, to say the least. She said they fashioned a sort of tactical weighted netting out of the wires and heavy lead pipes. One of the nights, the brothers decide to wait up and stake out whatever has been harassing their animals and property. She said they prepare themselves by taking bitter herb medicine and rubbing black ash from a ceremony fire on the top of their heads. They situated themselves above the sheep shed, giving them the best vantage point, allowing for the weighted netting to fall directly on top. They didn't have to wait long. Near the property line, hopping like a frog out of a cedar tree and sagebrush, came the skinwalker with a thud, thud, thud in the soft dirt. They waited quietly as the dogs barked and stayed in front of the doorway to the house. They said it hopped like a disjointed frog or some kind of animal they never saw in the wild. Soon enough, it made its way towards the sheep corral. The sheep got frightened and gathered on the far side of the corral, the furthest point in the entrapped space away from the skinwalker. At this point, she said bluntly and matter-of-factly, then they threw the netting down on top of it and captured it. They jumped down on top of it as well. No weird inhuman screams or shills, just a very human man yelling for them to let him go in Navajo. She said that they told her the skinwalker smelled like roadkill or rotting grease. She said they called the Navajo Nation police and stayed with the entrapped skinwalker until the unit arrived, which on the res was a while. The cops loaded the putrid-smelling culprit into the back of the police SUV. The entire time, the culprit was just screaming to let him go home, and he didn't do anything. The cops were Navajo, and realized upon arriving what the person was based solely on, how the person was dressed and smelling. Dressed in tattered furs and rotten grease and black paint smeared all over their body. I asked then what happened. She said the cops drove away with the person, and told the family they were going to do a full write-up and all that kind of protocol. However, the family never received a copy of the case or case number in the mail, like the cops assured them that they would. I asked her then what. She said I don't know what happened after that. She supposed they held the suspect in the drunk tank away from everyone and released them with all the other drunkards in the next morning. I got the chance, about 10 years ago, to go deep-sea diving off the coast of Mexico, where I firmly believe I saw what looked to be a plesiosaur. We were diving out, and probably around 20 miles off the coast, with me in the water, and my other 3 diving partners getting ready for their descent. I had ventured probably no more than 50 yards away from the boat, and, of course me being me, was the first one in the water. I could see out clearly in the water. The open ocean, there was this large shape coming in my direction. My 3 other diving partners were still on the boat. I think taking their time getting out to the water. I continued to watch this large shape, in awe, figuring it was a very large fish, possibly a sunfish. Well, I was partially right, as it got closer and began turning east to change directions. What I believe to change direction with the current, actually. That's when I got a pretty good look at the shape of it. It looked exactly like that of a plesiosaurus, a rather long neck with 4 smaller fins. It's like I was living in Jurassic Park. The thing about plesiosaur is they are a very distinctive shape. There is no mistaking or misidentifying them. That silhouette, that shape will always be with me. I was amazed at what I was seeing and couldn't believe that I was the only one seeing this amazing sight. I felt for my diving partners who still remained upon the boat. The whole entire sighting lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt much longer. Once it disappeared from view, I quickly swam back to the boat, yelling about what I had just seen, in total amazement. I thought it was incredible, breathtaking, an experience to be had. I boasted about how I just got to witness something that we all thought to be extinct. A couple of my friends believed me, but one of them just thought I was a loon and making it up. I know what I saw. There is no mistaking such a shape like that off in the water. The distance of this animal was far away, but not so far that I couldn't make out or distinguish what it was. It's like if a great white shark were to swim towards you and then turn into the current. From a good distance, a shark is distinctively a shark. There's no misidentifying it. They have a very unique shape and size. You don't have to be 20 feet away to get an estimate on the size and type of animal of those. The same applied to this scenario. Its neck and tail were very long, and it had a smaller head than what I envisioned, but maybe if I was closer, I could see more of the intricacies. From my distance, it looked to be a green-blue-gray color. The discovery of such a large beast from 40 million years ago makes for even more interesting discoveries that'll lead to more understanding of our prehistoric past. And because so much of the world's diversity, especially in the deep sea, can be found in the ocean floor, the discovery of so many ancient organisms will only fuel the quest for understanding this crucial step of cycle on our planet. This alone is the reason I strive for deep dives and to be pushing for more exploration. Good day. So recently, after talking about skinwalkers on PlayStation to freak people out, I've been having weird occurrences. Oftentimes, when I go out to smoke on my back porch, I can hear footsteps a lot of the time. It could just be deer, and probably is. I do live in Kentucky, which has lots of deer. But the other night, something crazy happened when I walked outside to go smoke, and I start hearing crazy noises coming from my neighbor's barn. It sounded like maybe raccoons mating, or something, or some small creature being brutally killed. I shined a spotlight over there in that general direction and didn't see anything, and didn't think much of it. So I walked to my smoke spot, and the next thing you know, I hear something that sounded extremely heavy, almost like a horse galloping, coming straight towards me, or a heavy man. I quickly turn on my spotlight, and I see a very large dog. It was either a wolf or a German shepherd. It had piercing yellow eyes, and it quickly sped past me and off into the night. That's weird, because I have never seen that dog or wolf ever before. Whenever it ran past me, the noises from the barn stopped. I know I'm not crazy either, because the neighbor's dog was going apeshit. A few nights before this, I was out buying weed at 2 a.m. on my road, and my dealer tells me somebody is walking down the road. So I get the goods, and I sit back and watch this person from behind a tree. It was just weird, because I have never seen anybody walking about this early in the morning. Just tonight, I went outside to go smoke, and I get hit with a nasty stench of rotting flesh, and a kind of nasty hermit crab smell. So I said, hell no, and went back in. I just went back out 30 minutes ago, and the stench is gone. I don't know what's going on. Do you guys think these occurrences sound like skinwalkers or some other supernatural creature? I do live in Kentucky, so I don't see how a skinwalker would be up this far northeast. It all started for me when I was a young boy, as I remember watching an educational program about animals living in caves on TV. The idea got me thinking about how many life forms that we see on this earth, and when I got older and started going on deep diving missions and saw a living plesiosaur, my heart felt to fear. I've been doing several deep-sea dives with various hobbyists, friends, and likes, including scuba diving and deep-sea fishing. In the depths of the ocean, deep water often causes a change in the food chains that may have the effect of changing the distribution of species and possibly even causing them to go extinct. It's amazing how such incredible creatures can live in this very harsh environment, yet remain seemingly unchanged. My friends and I have only just begun to learn more about the life on the deep and the many ways we can protect them from these dangerous predators. One of my friends is passionate about conservation and has been working with scientists worldwide to better understand life in the deep sea, and I'm glad the opportunity to work together made the most sense for me. What type of animal lived on the ocean floor around 500 million years ago? I can assure you that I have some interesting things to say about that, but I'll save that. It's easy to think that the life forms living on Earth today would have been extinct long before the dinosaurs. However, some of the most complex and important structures we see are formed when we find animals at the bottom of the sea. It takes thousands of years or longer for them to die. This is why I believe we saw the plesiosaur. Living at such depths and so many places to hide that the ocean offers, it would be very easy for elusive species of animals to hide and mask themselves to not be known to mankind. This is why we choose to only deep dive in certain areas, times, and depths, for protection against the unknown. Yes, we did indeed see what we truthfully believe to be a living dinosaur in the flesh close up. Even though plesiosaur are carnivorous and eat fish, it showed no signs of aggression towards us in the deep water and simply ignored us as it swam by, unfazed by our bright lights to see. It wasn't much bigger than a smaller elephant, which, when it belongs to a creature like this, is still shocking. I always imagined aquatic dinosaurs being so much larger, but it might have been a young one. We are currently advocating for bigger budgets to do even deeper diving missions, to explore regions and parts left to the ocean. We want to unveil to the world the undiscovered to mankind. Sorry for the long email. You'll hear from me again if we truly do capture great evidence. I have believed in skinwalkers most of my life, and I'm confident I've seen a skinwalker 2 times. I grew up spending a lot of time in southwest Colorado by the Four Corners, where there are Navajo and Ute Indian reservations. In the small town of Cortez, which is a non-res, there is a story known by locals about this place called Skinwalker Lane. It's this old dirt road, just outside of the reservation, that leads to an old abandoned cabin. The cabin is decades old, and is said to have been built unrightfully on Indian burial grounds by white men. As the story goes, a white family lived there and disappeared mysteriously. As a couple of dumb teenagers, me and a few of my cousins didn't believe in what we thought was a hoax, Skinwalker Lane, and wanted to go check it out. We all piled into our old Jeep SUV and drove all the way out to Skinwalker Lane at about 11 p.m. when it was pitch black outside. The sky was lit up from the moon, and you could make out the peaks of Sleeping Ute Mountain in the distance and the edges of the willows which lined either side of Skinwalker Lane. As we slowly eased down the road, the car got quiet, and we all had a weird feeling. Deer in groups of 2 or 3 kept poking their heads out of the willows and just stared at us without caution. I thought this was especially weird because deer are usually jumpy creatures. After about 1.5 miles of this road, we finally get to this clearing which opened up to a big field. At the other end of the field, you could see the old cabin. At this point, we were creeped out and reluctantly continued across the lightly used road until we were about 150 feet from the cabin. The cabin was very dark. The wood rotted, and there were weird carvings all over it that looked like some sort of tribal symbolism. We decided to just sit and look at it for a while to see if anything happened. We were too scared to walk up to it. Out of nowhere, this shrill, skin-peeling howl came out of nowhere. It was a long howl, but by the time it had ended, it changed and sounded more like a man screaming. From the left side, something on 2 feet ran heavy-footed behind the cabin. But on the other side came out an enormous coyote that looked similar to a wolf in size. The coyote just stood and stared us down, eyes glowing a deep blood red. We were so freaked out and drove out of there immediately. I will always believe in skinwalkers after that night. About 2 years ago, I went with a friend. Let's call him John. On his boat out to sea for a little vacation with him and his wife. Our plan was to sail up and down the west coast for weeks at a time. He's a lover of the ocean and understands that there is more to the sea than we can comprehend. He's seen an abundant amount of life out there. Seals, sharks, octopus, all sorts of sea life. He's gone deep diving, but has also cage dived with sharks. The man is fearless and a relentless sailor. His respect and love for the sea comes from his father, who took him out to sea all the time as a younger boy. Me? Not so much. I used this vacation as an opportunity to get away from my life troubles for a while, since at the time I was at rock bottom and was going through a really rough patch in my life with addiction and bad people. Moving forward, we're out on the coast, probably no more than 10 miles out at sea, when something extremely large goes underneath the boat. I don't know anything about sea life, and I don't claim to. I mean, I know the basic stuff, but I couldn't tell you about whale migrations or anything like that. I am the farthest thing from a marine biologist. My first thought was that it was a whale swimming underneath the boat. The boat got rocked pretty hard. I guessed at the time whatever went underneath us must have just bumped into us by accident. My friend comes out of the cabin, excited, telling his wife to come out here, that there's a whale close by. So my guess obviously wasn't that wrong. I trusted my friend because he knows what he's talking about when it comes to being out at sea. So I quickly ran to the starboard side to see what I thought was going to be a whale emerging to the surface in the distance. It wasn't. We didn't see anything other than a bunch of bubbles a little ways off. Right when John was about to say, "Get my binoculars," to his wife, this large serpent-like body rises out of the water, away from the ship, and goes back down again. When I say large, I'm talking large. Capital L, font size 72. There was no head that rose beyond the water, and no tail. It just looked to be part of the body. John and I were in total awe at the size of this serpent-like body that appeared out of the water. I'll tell you exactly what I remember. The under part of it was white, while the top part was a green-gray scale pattern. The weather outside was perfectly clear and sunny. We couldn't have asked for a better day or time to have a sighting like this. There was no mistaking what we were seeing. The body portion of whatever animal this belonged to was much longer than that of a whale, so I want to clear that up right now. The girth of this part of the body we witnessed was larger than that of a whale, to which some might be in disbelief, but when I say large, I do mean it. What I'm guessing happened is that whatever this was must have come underneath our boat, heading off into the west, and as it got further out, my assumption is that it probably dove downwards underwater, and as a result, part of its body curved and coiled above the surface before submerging again. If I'm not being clear enough, just imagine a colossal-sized sea serpent that we saw part of the body of. I'm going to try and give you an estimate of girth and potential length, but I can't be so sure. Because we were out at sea, I have no way to measure how far away or how far close we were to it. I'm going to go ahead and guess maybe 70 yards out. I will say it was close enough we got a look at it for a few seconds as it appeared out of the water and then submerged again. When you see something like that, It's hard not to be in total awe of the size of something like that living in the water. I know it was visibly larger all around in girth than that of a whale. You could just tell by the sight alone. I learned from John that blue whales are around 13 meters in girth, and this was maybe double that. Length could be very hard to judge. Bear with me, but it could have possibly been 60 feet minimum, very easily. With how large that part of the body that came out, and how serpent-like it was, it would make total sense for it to have a much more elongated body. It could have been more than 100 feet in length. We don't know. We didn't see. Whatever it was thought to have been large enough to rock the boat as hard as it did by just barely bumping into us from underneath. We were anchored at the time of this event, and it was roughly 2 to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Because we were anchored, nothing really happened. We didn't drift off or anything like that. We would have, though, had we not been anchored, because of the sheer force of this bump. The large amount of bubbles we saw right before part of the body surfaced was an immense amount of air escaping to the surface. So it's possible that whatever this was, like a whale, isn't 100% aquatic in its bio-makeup. I'm just throwing a bunch of speculation out here, based on what me and John saw. I spent some time talking all this over with John on the phone before sending this to you, and so a lot of the knowledge of whales, measurements, etc. and whatnot are mainly from him, because like I said, my knowledge is so minimal of sea life. John's wife never came out of the cabin at the time, and I think she was doing something for John, like getting his binoculars, so she didn't witness it. Only John and I did. So, I have a forest behind my house where a lot of weird things happen. Things such as seeing things running from behind trees. They are usually taller than I am, and I am 6 foot, and pale white in appearance, are also very fast. The forest is around 1 kilometer behind my house through a field. When I am out there, I hear weird noises such as what sounds like a person trying to sound like a big bird, even when it is the middle of winter or in the middle of the field walking back from the forest with no birds around or overhead, as it was a blizzard. Other things have happened that are kind of unexplainable, such as perfect triangles dug in the snow with no tracks leading to or from them, and all of a sudden, I will get a powerful fight or flight response. However, recently seems to have moved from the forest to my house. And one night, when I was about to fall asleep at what side of my window, which opens to the roof, I heard grunting and scratching noises on the roof. I got the same fight or flight response and jumped up to close the window. When I started to close, I heard scratching noises running towards the window, but managed to close it in time before it got there. When I hear taps and scratches such as that oftentimes afterwards, there are large amounts of time that go by without being able to account for them. For example, 20 minutes feels like 2 hours, or 2 hours feels like 20 minutes. I have investigated the area around my house and have found no reason for there to be tapping noises of any kind. Any advice or suggestions, or am I just being paranoid? I saw an unknown kind of fish, with tentacle-like tendrils protruding on its back, the size of a small person, covered in dark green and black scales, with a tapered face and bright yellow eyes. This was during my vacation to Japan I had years and years ago. I was with my friend Akira, who spoke fluent Japanese, sightseeing and going all around the country to see the beauty Japan held. We were visiting Lake Yamanaka. My Japanese friend was doing some photography work on different sightings throughout the area. Lake Yamanaka is gorgeous in every way. It is one of the 5 lakes around Mount Fuji, I'm told. I only know these things because my friend Akira had told me all this before taking me out sightseeing. Akira, who was doing photography at the time, was setting up her tripod. That's when close by us came this large fish, bigger than we could have both ever imagined. It came up right to the surface, just underneath the water. It was clear as day, and you could see nearly every detail of this fish as it nearly broke surface. It almost glided across the water effortlessly. It was so graceful. It was amazing. You could make out every distinction in the details I just explained. As it moved past us, you could see these long tendrils at the end of its tail that dragged behind it by 10 or more feet. Long, thick tendrils that looked very reminiscent of tentacles. I don't know if they moved or had any use or whatnot, but it was an incredible sight to witness. There were a bunch of other people on the path next to us watching this as it went on. This fish swam up near us and then veered off and kept going while staying right underneath the surface in full view. People were astonished, pointing their cameras and snapping pictures. I had never seen a fish like this in my life. My friend Akira, who, like I said, is Japanese and spoke it fluently, also spoke good English and told me that everybody else was just as surprised as us. She did not recognize such a fish ever before. Sorry my story is so short. There isn't much more to it. I had tried to Google a fish in Japan or on lakes with a similar description, but I could not come up with much. Maybe there are just certain fish that belong to certain areas of the world. I can't exactly say I've always been a believer in skinwalkers. My dad used to talk about them and how he believed in them, but I always thought it was silly. Tonight, that changed, however. I snuck out of my house to go out on a walk. It was about 2 a.m., and my parents didn't know. It was mildly peaceful. I'm not very much afraid of the dark, so I don't get anxious from these walks. It's windy tonight, so there were a lot of loud noises. I got far from my house where there is a large stretch of woods. It's an area where we don't usually see deer because it's close to a highway. It's southern Maryland, so it's usually foxes and birds at best. I inspected the woods and had the most terrifying and blood-curdling fear when I saw what I can really only describe as a skinny, disfigured silhouette with antlers, but not like a big deer. They were small. It stood tall and is unlike anything I've ever seen. I can't even comprehend what I've seen. I don't know if it could have been real. Within 10 seconds of seeing, I took off running and I couldn't think of anything else to do. I ran fast, not looking back. I was so terrified. I ran through my neighbor's yard to get home faster. I don't know how to feel about it. I don't know if I'm overreacting and I just saw a deer or something, but I don't know if I can sleep. I'm constantly looking outside and now terrified.